Is there a problem with masculinity in today's world? Well, according to social media at the moment, it seems that there is.
People are being cancelled for being a man's man.
There's still a war going on against men.
This whole idea of being toxically masculine is absolutely garbage.
Do I think we have a crisis of masculinity? Yes.
Male energy, male thinking, male energy is vilified.
You already know what life's like already when you're not that masculine. You feel weak, you feel feminine, you feel like a pushover.
Men are being taught to become weaker, demasculinize them, more effeminate.
There is a trend online at the moment whereby if you throw out phrases like toxic masculinity, crisis of masculinity, etc., it can garner a lot of attention. And yes, indeed, I can obviously see the irony with me making a video on that exact topic, but let me explain why I am doing so. Having experienced what I did back in 2016, for me to now be seeing this narrative emerging and developing online, it leaves me feeling compelled to comment on the matter. To go alongside today's video, I am going to retrospectively reflect on a clip from when I was on the Mark Bell Power Project in February. Mark and Nsima brought up the topic of how I perceive masculinity in the modern world, given that I attempted suicide in 2016 as the result of having very traditionally masculine traits. I was only 20 years old. I've come out the other side, fortunately, but it gives me a very clear perspective on where I went wrong, which is why I'm so passionate about this topic, because if I place myself in the shoes of somebody at 20 years old today, with everything that's available online and the narratives that are emerging, I fear it would have only made my situation worse. Just to give a bit of context on my understanding of traditional masculinity back then, it was the typical obvious stuff that a lot of us will have heard about over the years, and that was the best grades, to get to the best university, to get to the best job, to get the best promotion, to get the best car, to get the best house, to get the best wife, to send my kids to this school, to go on these holidays, to retire happy, and then to spend my days living out playing golf in an exotic part of the world. Alongside showing no emotion, being totally resilient, being the caregiver, and putting everybody else's priorities before my own when it came to my emotional well-being along the way. And that nearly killed me. One final thing that I want to say before we dive in is that I appreciate for regular viewers of the channel, this might be a little bit left field to the regular hybrid athlete, fitness challenges, etc., but this is not something that I am not used to talking about on a regular basis, as I will explain in more detail later.
I'm curious about this because you had an idea of masculinity before, so how has your idea of masculinity, but also emotional expression as a man, how has that changed for you?
So, masculinity to me is not a blanket term. There is not a definition that I would attach to it, because I think it means different things to different people. But what I don't want to get into the trap of is attaching certain traits or overly stereotyping what it should involve, because I think that's the trap that the previous traditional definition of masculinity led me to feeling the way that I did.
And doesn't allow us to celebrate the individuality of all men and the different expressions and strengths and weaknesses that we all have.
But with that in mind, I do think, like we've said with Conversation on Goggins, I do think the notions of hard work, confidence and self-development, moving yourself forwards, let's call it, I think there's a lot of traits of traditional masculinity that in and of themselves aren't a bad thing, but it's how it's manifested in the individual. And I think what helps the person do that is actually having the openness and honesty to confront how they feel about things in general terms, being open and honest with those around them about how they feel about certain things, how they respond to certain things. Because there's so many people that suffer through a job they hate on a day-to-day basis. And whilst that's been normalized, it's something that's going to impact your mental health, which might then be why you hide those feelings in the gym. And I'm one of the people that says the iron is my therapy or something like that, because it's your crutch, it's your escape, but it's not the root cause of the problem.
I think it's important just to reflect on that as well, because this is something I've spoken a lot about recently, whereby running is my therapy, the iron is my therapy, triathlon is my therapy, and I don't want in any way to say that that is a bad thing and that it's not a good coping mechanism, but it is exactly that. It is a coping mechanism. It is creating the space for you to cope with the things that you aren't necessarily so content with in your day-to-day life, to try and create the space for you to actually unpack the reasons why you might be feeling the way that you are. So I appreciate people will have different opinions on therapy, but using a coping mechanism as a crutch to allow you to suffer through a life you are not necessarily happy living has an expiry date. As I did when I was suffering with my experience of depression, and training was essentially the only thing that I could enjoy on a day-to-day basis. And ironically, it allowed me to suffer a lot longer than I think I otherwise would have done had I not had that coping mechanism. So I'm still not quite sure how to feel about that, because Obviously, it made me happier and more content on a day-to-day basis when I was in fact miserable, but it also meant that I was miserable for longer. So something to think about at the very least.
And I think masculinity in the modern world is at a real turning point at the moment, because it's something that I've seen to be more topical than ever. And I think that's probably partly down to Andrew Tate's presence on TikTok, Reels, just everywhere, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
And I won't comment on that much because it's not something I understand all that much, because I've not really deep dived on all of the messaging. But what Andrew Tate has done is reveal that there is a gap with young men across the world that needs filled. I don't think he's the person to fill it, but they need a role model. Men need a role model. They need some.
Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan; those are guys that also filled the gap too.
Yeah. And it's the case of the desperation that's being felt for attaching themselves to this idol that comes from somewhere. So I think the question to ask is, where does that come from? I don't have the answer.
This is important. This is arguably the most important component of the whole video, I think, because as you can see, I kind of didn't want to speak too out of turn there, because I'm not necessarily all that informed on the ecosystem of those online in short form content that speak about masculinity as a sort of a main topic, mainly because it's not something I actually get much value from diving into, because it makes me ask questions about myself, when in reality I'm very confident in my own perception of masculinity as a result of having had the experience that I have had. So I don't necessarily have any firm opinions on any of the figureheads online that talk about this stuff, but I do believe that the rise of short form content and reels has given us a really chaotic way of interacting with information that makes us want to snap, this is how I feel, that's how I feel, they're doing that, I should do that, and not given us a conscious, deliberated perspective on how these things relate to us, the individual, rather than just emulating what somebody else should be doing. And when I was younger, all I was trying to do was emulate this vision of a perfect man, and that doesn't exist. We're all fallible, we're all vulnerable, we're all emotional, and we're actually better off for being those things, and having an emotional understanding and an awareness of them has made me a much better man, person, son, fiance, dog dad, athlete, whatever you want to call it, along the way. All I would encourage is for people to make sure that they don't fall into the trap of the surge in dopamine and the quick reactive takes that come from reels and short form content, and things that are ultimately out there to grab your attention, sometimes often with a back end to sell you something as well, which is the commercialization of the uncertainty in young men in the modern world. Which is why I'm so terrified and feel compelled to talk about this, because that didn't exist when I was younger, but I was the perfect customer.
But I think why are young men feeling the way that they are? Is it a lack of direction? Is it not knowing who they want to be? Is it the education system isn't
in America
in the right direction?
Absent dads.
Okay.
In America, it's a big problem.
Just quickly on that, as you'll see in the conversation, this isn't something I'd considered as much as Americans might, because I think it's a more prevalent problem in the States than it is in the UK. But Nsima talks about it really openly, which is massively valuable. And just to touch very briefly on something for the previous section is, I know there'll be people watching that are maybe huge fans of some of the people and the figureheads that I've mentioned or have come up in this conversation. And I just want to reinforce that I think there are elements of what they say that are very valuable. There's elements of what they say that are to be taken with a pinch of salt, and there's elements of what they say and do that are perhaps to be entirely ignored. But that is the beauty of individual choice. And I think this is where ideological thinking and placing yourself in a box of, this is the way I must think, this is the person I must emulate, I must be like this, rather than taking the discussions and the narratives and the considerations of these individuals and using them to inform how they manifest with you, the individual, the young man, the man of any age, rather than taking the gospel of person X, because that is the same mechanism as traditional followings have been throughout history. And this feels like a suitable time to mention my degree in theology and religion, which I studied whilst at university when I was granted most miserable. But the reason that I flagged the fact that young men might be looking for a savior or a person to idolize in a sense comes from a place of confusion, desperation, needing to attach themselves to something bigger than themselves. And I think that's where these figureheads online have had so much success, because they're attaching themselves onto that floating gap that needs to be filled with something. And I think it's dangerous because it can open up ideological thinking, and ideological thinking doesn't allow for individual manifestation to occur. And again, I'm just looking at this through the lens of my own experience in the past and thinking about how exposed I would have been to these things when I was younger.
I haven't experienced many examples of that. I know 2 people over in the UK where that's a big part of their upbringing.
No, you know 3. Seriously.
Okay. Well, there we go. If that's something I haven't really considered.
Well,
in
and
this
then he
context
has an
before.
incredible mother, so like that
It kind of
very helpful.
Do you think your mother effectively replicated the traits that a father would have done? Do you think one person can effectively fill the gap by replicating the traits and giving you the lessons, or do you think there will always be a void from that person being missing?
Replicated, not necessarily. She did a great job of putting me in scenarios and situations where there was more men present. For example, I played sports as a kid. I had great male coaches, which were great role models. And she just did a really good job of putting me around people that would be positive male role models, which was extremely helpful. But one thing I did find is like, as I, 18, 19, 20, as I got older, I found that I was just like, I felt incomplete, even though I had a lot of those male role models, because I was just like, God, there must be something I'm missing. So I always felt that there was something I was missing as a young man and as a man, because my dad really wasn't there for a lot of it. But I think just having that exposure was huge, and it was helpful. Was she able to fill that though herself? No, but she did a great job.
So the flip side is, how has your relationship with the notion of masculinity and your sense of self been without a dad? Because the other end of the spectrum could be if you have a hyper-masculine dad that's very emotionally unaware, that's making you feel like you should exist in a certain way, that could be just as damaging to a young man's sense of self as it could be him not being there in the first place. So as a young man, late teens, early 20s, that sort of thing, that sort of age where you really ask yourself these questions, do you think you were better off having had a more feminine in an emotional sense? Again, I don't want to attach too much to the sort of gender focused terms, because again, it's falling into job stereotyping. But generally, women are better at speaking about their feelings openly and coming to solutions and talking about it and moving on.
That's reflected in the statistics around suicide as well. I mean, I'm very up to speed with these statistics in the UK, having raised just over £100,000 for the Movember Foundation. In fact, I have stuff behind me to say as much, and along the way I've learned and become very familiar with exactly how this is manifested. So 75% of suicides are male, and on average, having spoken to Johan Hari on the Modern Mind podcast, he informed me that in the modern Western world, based on the sort of pools of data that he was referring to, that there are 0 close friends that men can rely on if they ever felt like they were in a crisis. And that scared the shit out of me when I heard that thought, because it made me really question my own social circles, my own support network, and really ask myself the question. And I've had that conversation with my friends, with my family, and there is a real lack of faith in the reliability of those around you, even if you're very close, open, and honest with them. Where that comes from, I don't have the answers. Why that is the case, I don't know. What can we do about it to move things forward? Take action, agency, responsibility to have more open and honest conversations about how we can move forwards progressively, how we can become better versions of ourselves, how we can work hard, how we can get our head down and achieve the things we want to achieve, but not to do it in a stubborn and reckless way that leaves us a shallow, emotionless pit of misery and despair, because putting ourselves in silos and embracing loneliness for the sake of embracing loneliness because you think that hiding yourself away emotionally from those around you is going to make you stronger, it will make you weaker, as it did with me, and as I've already said, it nearly killed me. The crux of this is loneliness, and you can point fingers at social media, you can point fingers at a fatherless culture in some parts of America, perhaps you can point fingers at whatever you feel most aligned to in your world. And I think that's the important point, is we all feel differently about our experience and what we've had access to in terms of perception, rather than what somebody says based through the lens of their experience online. I've seen this manifested out in my experience speaking to schools and corporates over the years, because I go in and share my experience. I reflect on the lessons I learned and the mistakes I made with my period of depression, suffering in total silence, as to share my emotions would make me less of a man. That's how I felt at the time. And the narrative that's forming in the younger generation, schools, teachers' concerns, corporates in terms of a working environment, is that the world has moved on at a pace that we cannot necessarily keep up with, because we have the advice of our parents. We have a generation below us that suddenly seems incomprehensible in terms of the way that they're living their life. And that makes us wonder, are we doing the right thing? Are they doing the right thing? How do I interact here? How do I interact there? Should I change X? Should I look at Y? Am I in the right city? Am I spending my time with the right person? Is my circle close enough? Should I actually take my money for the car that I really enjoy on a day-to-day basis and invest it into the stock market because that's what some guy told me to do on a podcast clip that I saw online.
Knowledge.
And then you're just kind of in this state where you don't feel like you're doing anything right, you don't feel like you're moving forwards, and before you know it, you can isolate yourself out of fear of seeming emotional or spiraling, and that is exactly the trap that I fell into. Which is why I think, from Nseema's point of view, to circle back to where we started, that gap that he's referring to is something that I struggle to comprehend because I was fortunate and privileged enough to grow up with a loving and supportive father. And even with a loving and supportive father, I found myself in a position where my perception of masculinity was warped in a very negative way.
Do you feel in your younger years you were more able to do that than those male role models and the males around you because of the upbringing that you'd had from your mother?
You know, it's interesting. I grew up with 3 women in the house, my mom, my sister, and my grandma. Those are the people who raised me. But I also came from an African household. So it's not generally
different culture.
The culture, even the women in the culture aren't, I would say, as emotionally expressive in the way that you would think is normal for women to be.
Fiercely practical, aren't they, though?
Extremely practical. I think that's the thing. Extremely practical. So it's like, I didn't, when I was a kid, I didn't express the way I felt about many things, primarily because I didn't necessarily feel comfortable doing that for some reason. It was partially because my mom had a lot of stressful work. She was taking care of 2 kids. So I didn't feel it necessary we didn't talk about feelings. One thing I noticed as I got into when I got into adulthood and I was in relationships with women, I didn't talk about my feelings. I was extremely practical. So a woman comes to her with a problem, so it's like, here's a solution. You know, I didn't talk to my ex-girlfriends about like my feelings about things. And because of that,
let's go play sports.
No,
You're like, huh?
Yeah. So that's one thing that I had to get better at as an adult,
I think
as a
your
man.
mom did a great job keeping you busy. Like
She did.
as a young man, like you're just so many people are like full of anger or energy or whatever it is, sexual energy, anger, like lots of things.
Yeah.
And it sounds like she did a great job keeping you just busy because you were doing piano lessons and a bunch of different sports and all kinds of stuff, right?
That's an important point as well, because I think back to my childhood and I never really had a gap in the week. There was always something going on, whether it was playing RuneScape, playing Modern Warfare 2, trying this sport, trying that sport, being at school, doing something at the weekend with my parents, scrapping with my brother, whatever it might be. And then you enter the working world, you enter independence at sort of, I mean, here in the UK, university starts about 18. You can obviously defer it, similar in the US, I know. But at that age, when you're thrusted towards independence, you have to fill your own time and you have to take responsibility and action towards filling that time sensibly. Obviously, sensible is a relative scale depending on the goals and the approach of the individual, but
Relax, drink Stella.
you are left with time to fill that, if you're not careful, can be filled with negative thoughts, comparison, questioning, negative behavior patterns, and you can find yourself in a comfortable, convenient cycle of doing those things over and over whereby they become the norm. And this is where, with work being such a big part of people's lives, before you know it, you can find yourself doing something you don't enjoy doing for 2, 3, 4 years, and the coping mechanisms that you have outside of work to tolerate it have become negative and not rewarding intrinsically for you. And I think that's where the key point is. You have your family closely around you if you're fortunate enough to do so growing up, as Nseema did. His mum kept him busy, but he had his family around him pre-independence. And then when you enter independence, you have less access to that support network. And I think traditional masculinity trains us inherently to almost step away from that support network rather than finding a new one, embracing a new one, cultivating a new one. And that just becomes the norm, which means that when you do or might find yourself in crisis or questioning or wondering what you're doing day to day, you feel protective of those feelings rather than having somebody to your left or to your right that you can be open and honest with them about. So again, a reflection that I'm having watching myself reflect from February.
Like that's one of the things, like, you know, what happened to you with, your isolation and some of those things. When I was 13, I had something called Auschwitz so I couldn't run, and I played soccer.
Knees, isn't it?
Both knees, so I couldn't run anymore. And that was the first time like I had actual depressive episodes, and she was confused because like I wasn't talking anymore. Like I literally wasn't talking to anybody. I'd go to school, come home, she'd ask me what's up, I'm good. I'd go do homework, go to sleep. Like that was it.
That's the worst from a kid.
Exactly, but she got me a gym membership. Started working out, fucking total 180. So it made a big difference.
But by total 180, do you mean that's how many pounds you benched on day one, judging by the size of
Oh,
your
absolutely. No. But
That was a skull crusher.
but it made a big difference for me, man. It made a big difference. But the thing is like when I got older, I had to get better at expressing the way I felt to the partners in my life, because that just wasn't something that I was personally comfortable doing. I didn't see that as a very masculine thing. So that's one thing that, as I learned more about how I can express the way I feel about things, there's a way of doing it, but I can express that. First off, I felt better expressing that in a healthy way rather than just like getting angry and then using the iron as my therapy. Because whenever I'd get angry or whenever I would get, I'd feel something bad about something. It was just like, go exert yourself. And that helps to an extent, but keeping that in didn't help me much.
Yeah, there's a boiling point that'll come eventually.
There's a boiling point.
I found myself in that boiling point and it wasn't pretty, and it's not something I'd wish upon my worst enemy, but it has taught me a lot about myself. And on top of that, from the self-reflection I've had over the years, looking back on a completely incomprehensible state of mind that I was in from 2014 to 2016, I've also been privileged enough to speak to some of the most fascinating minds on the planet through the Modern Mind podcast, where, this is the giveaway, really, to be honest, where people far more intelligent than I can tell me about their experience as athletes, entrepreneurs, psychologists, and give a perspective that informs a well-rounded understanding of what the trials of modern life are for the majority. Obviously, we all have our own stuff going on, and I don't want to generalize in this video too much. You can probably see I'm trying to be very careful not to do that, but I think we need to look at things through a lens of individuality a little bit more. And that's where content and social media, if you reframe your relationship with it, can be fantastic, because it gives you a variety of opinions to hear, process, understand, unpack, place within your own experience, and then understand enough to move forward within your own life. But I think the saturation of choice that we have means that everything's so fast-paced, it's difficult to even be able to unpack the takes online enough to be able to manifest them into your own understanding of how you, the individual, should be moving forwards. And that's actually why I don't spend much time engaging with short-form content at all myself. It's why I don't really feel qualified to have an opinion on some of the figureheads that talk most intently about this stuff, because it's not content that I engage with, because I'm confident and I have strong enough foundations in my own sense of self to not feel like I need to take it from external influences. And that's something I'm fortunate to have, but it has come through a very negative experience. And I think the real important message here is that you shouldn't have to go through a negative experience. You shouldn't need to hit rock bottom before you can start climbing your way out. And the loneliness epidemic that we're facing in the modern world, the saturation of choice, the fact that you've got one person telling you that you should invest in Airbnb arbitrage and the next person saying that if you don't drive a McLaren in Miami, then you're failing.
If you're a guy in your 20s and you don't have a Lamborghini, you should actually sit down and have like a serious discussion with yourself as to why you don't have a Lambo.
Yep. And the next person saying, well, I'm perfectly happy working my 9 to 5 at KPMG with my 3 kids. Where do I sit? Who am I? What am I doing? How should I be spending my time? We only get one life. Am I going to improve on what my parents did? Am I going to impress them? Am I going to make myself happy? Am I going to find my life partner? Oh, what's going on? All of these questions that manifest and spiral, if you're not open and honest and have discussions with those around you, can spiral into an incomprehensible, irrational state of mind, as I have experienced myself. I am now very happy. I have a rational state of mind, and I think back to a younger version of myself, and I cannot process how I found myself in the situation where I would rather be dead than face another day. And what's really terrifying to me is the thought of everything that's happened since then, all of the times I've laughed, the people I've met, the experiences that I've had, almost like that, never would have existed. And that's the thing that gets me quite emotional thinking about it, and why I've done my best today to try and be as neutral as I can from my perspective, but also acknowledging that yes, there'll have been some buzzwords in there, yes, there'll have been some things that people don't necessarily agree with, and that's absolutely fine. I am not trying to present a vision for the perfect man, a vision for how you should live your life through the bias of my own experience. All I'm encouraging is a more open mind to your concept of masculinity, not the concept of masculinity, because they are entirely different things, and aiming for a idealistic perfect vision of X is unattainable in every pursuit. Whether it's masculinity, finances, I will be happy when I get X, I will be happy when I earn Y, I will be content when I drive this car, when I get to this age and retire, everything will be great. There's always something else. Hedonistic adaptation is something that's very, very aggressive in the modern world, and I think reflecting on ourselves and how we interact with the modern world, intrinsically speaking, is the best thing that we can do. So I'm not going to give too much prescriptive advice, if any, really, but all I would encourage you to do is take all content that you see online with a pinch of salt, my own included, because it's through the lens and planning and biases of the individual. You have your own lens, you have your own biases, and you have your own planning to attend to, and that's what matters, ultimately. Trying to emulate the life of another person is not possible, so what we should aim to do is unpack and process their takes that we see online so that we can understand them within our own lives. And beyond that, it's being as open and honest with those around you so that you can form your own opinion on the man that you want to be rather than the one that you believe you should be. They're two very different things, and I have learned that the hard way. My definition of masculinity is now almost non-existent. I'm not even sure that there is merit in having a definition. I have a manifestation of it for myself individually, and that is being responsible for my decisions, being honest about my decisions, taking action, moving forwards, constantly striving for more, but being emotionally aware enough to understand that I'm gonna have to take my foot off the gas sometimes, and sometimes I'm gonna put my pedal to the floor and enjoy the process. But along the way, learn that the process will teach me a lot more about myself, that if I don't understand it, I don't unpack it, if I hide it away with the iron or with another coping mechanism, then I might actually lose myself along the way. And that's where negative behavior patterns can begin, and that's where things can become complicated. So I appreciate that's been a lot of words today. That's quite a profound video in terms of how to understand things, and I've done my very best to try and not be too one-sided in my way of thinking. And I don't want this to be binary because I don't believe that it is. So if you do have anything that you want to share or any opinions on the matter, please do comment them down below. I'm sure it will be a melting pot of opinions, and that actually would be a fantastic thing because individuality, as I've said, is the thread of DNA that runs through all of this, in my opinion. And please do make sure to like the video and that you have subscribed if you are interested in more. We are actually going to unpack a little bit more about my personal experience from 2014 to 2016 on the channel again very soon. So if you want any more context on that, on myself as an individual, then do keep an eye out for that. But I hope that has been thought-provoking at the very least, and I actually don't want anyone to leave with any sort of ideology, because if you have done, then you've done exactly what I have recommended you not to do. So at the very least, I hope you've had some food for thought and that you are famished for more.